Adrift by Manish Tewari. In conversation will be Mr. Karan Avtar Singh, the former Chief Secretary Punjab. So before we begin, it's important to acknowledge the hands behind today's event. The Punjab Lit Foundation may only be 2 years old, but its footprint on our state is already profound. Co-founded by the esteemed authors Kushwant Singh and Sana Kaushal, the foundation believes that literature and social responsibility go hand in hand. Beyond the world of books, they have become a powerful voice in the fight against substance abuse through brave initiatives like the People's Walk Against Drugs and the deeply moving Mothers Against Drugs campaigns. They're proving that stories don't just live on pages. They can change the very fabric of our society. We are honored to be hosted by an organization that writes a better future for Punjab every single day. Now, hope everybody has enjoyed their sips and bites. Before we dive into the intellectual heart of this evening, we must take a moment to acknowledge the warmth and hospitality that makes an evening like this possible. Our deepest gratitude goes to Mr. and Mrs. Sidhu of Four Seasons for graciously hosting today's high tea. There's nothing quite like a good cup of tea or coffee and great company to set the stage for a deep dive into the global politics. Now we have had our refreshments. Now it's time for some intellectual nourishment. So I'll move to the introductions here. It is a privilege to introduce a leader who is as much a student of the world as he's a representative of the people. While many of us know him as a member of parliament for Chandigarh and previously for Ludhiana and Shri Anandpur Sahib, he's also one of the country's most respected legal and political minds and a former Union Minister of Information and Broadcasting. If you want to understand where India stands in the global power dynamic, you talk to someone who has been in the room where it happens. Manish Tewari hasn't just witnessed Indian history over the last few decades, he has been an active participant in it. Author of 5 books, including the bestseller 10 Flashpoints, Manish joins us to discuss his later work, A World Adrift. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Manish Tewari. Sir, can we have you on the stage, please? Have a seat. It is an honor to introduce a man whose career defines the gold standard of public service in India, Mr. Karan Avtar Singh, who is a veteran of the Indian Administrative Service, having served as the Chief Secretary to the Government of Punjab. Beyond his administrative heights, he's a formidable scholar holding a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan and a law degree from Delhi University. From managing the state's finances and infrastructure to chairing the Punjab Water Regulation and Development Authority, his impact on the region is structural and long-lasting. Today, he continues to shape global strategy as a senior advisor at Capstone LLC in Washington, D.C. Please welcome a true architect of governance, Mr. Karan Avtar Singh. They say books and plants both need the right environment to thrive. To ensure our guest takes a little bit of Punjab's green spirit home with them, I'd like to call upon Kushwant Singh, co-founder of Punjab Lit Foundation, to facilitate Mr. Manish Tewari with a fresh plant. Kushwantji, if you could please join us on the stage. Now, can we have Sana Kaushal, co-founder of Punjab Lit Foundation, to facilitate Mr. Karan Avtar Singh? Can we have one picture together, please, before we start our session? All four of you, please, together. Now, before we dive into the heart of today's discussion, I'd like to call upon our host and co-founder, Mr. Kushwant Singh, to formally welcome our panel and this wonderful gathering. Kushwantji, please.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Punjab Lit Foundation, I welcome you all and thank you for taking out time to join us for what I can assure you will be a very engaging and pertinent conversation, given the times we are living in. The author of the book, Mr. Manish Tewari, Member of Parliament and former I&B Minister, and the moderator of the day, Mr. Karan Avtar Singh, former Chief Secretary of Punjab, both of whom have been eloquently introduced by our MC of the day, Jasleen, are two very erudite, highly qualified and experienced individuals in their respective fields. Even though the ensemble is of a tall political figure and a dyed-in-wool seasoned bureaucrat, it promises to go beyond the realm of a typical yes minister setting and is expected to be frank and open. While reading the book, I was reminded of a book which I read recently, Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall, where countries, through long-range weapons or even the colonization of territories, attempt to overcome their geographic disadvantages. A World Adrift brings into play the premise of raison d'etat, meaning a government's policy where national interest takes precedence over moral, ethical, or legal constraints. A World Adrift is a page-turner that quite well matches the pace of a world that seems to be drifting apart at a neck-breaking speed. To give you a brief introduction of the Punjab Lit Foundation, which Jasleen actually has already done, it was established as a Section 8 non-profit company in 2024, and within just 2 years it has become helming one of the strongest civil society movements against drugs in Punjab, through its flagship programs, Peoples Against Drugs and Mothers Against Drugs. In fact, we walked almost about 200 kilometers in Punjab with the People's Walk Against Drugs. The People's Walk Against Drugs, which was started as an effort to take the discussion about drugs out of drawing rooms and turn it into a civil society movement, has grown into a significant public initiative. The Honorable Governor of Punjab has joined the walk twice, and this time Mr. Manish Tewari also lent his support alongside thousands of people who showed solidarity with our effort. Mothers Against Drugs is the outcome of People's Walk Against Drugs, is a grassroots program where we visit schools and organize special PTMs for mothers of children from classes 8 to 12. Through expert sessions, we empower them with knowledge on how they become the first line of defense against drugs in Punjab, or for that matter, in any state of India. I would request you consider supporting this initiative because gatherings like this bring together people who have the capacity to make a difference. If we all walk the talk, we can truly change the tide. I would also want to thank Naveen and Niti Sidhu, I don't see them here though, for hosting this IT. And with this, I leave the stage for the conversation to begin. Thank you.
So welcome all. Manish, this book, before we get into it, do you have an astrologer who's really good, who guided you how to name the book?
Well, before we commence, may I thank the Punjab Lit Foundation, Kushwant, Karan, you, and all of you ladies and gentlemen for coming here on a Sunday evening. I'm extremely gratified, and to some who are being subjected to this torture for the second time, my profoundest apologies. I kind of have a direct line, to the guy who tweets.
Yeah, talking of tweets, or now that the platform is X, I call them exclamations. So what's going on now, and especially in the Strait of Hormuz, it's very much what the title of your book says, and you talk about Iran in your book. So would you like to tell us all, because we're all your constituents, we're in Chandigarh, and this World Adrift is hitting home. We don't have LPG in our kitchens, and we are worried. So as our representative, would you like to reassure us that Trump will perhaps chicken out again? So the term is taco, I'm told, for that. And will we have a Taco Bell ringing on the Strait of Hormuz soon? Or on the other hand, do you feel that Iran is in this for the long run because they have the asymmetric power to, disrupt energy supplies? So what's your take on Hormuz?
Well, Karan, first of all, there isn't one war playing out in the Persian Gulf. There are multiple wars which are playing themselves out. And unfortunately, it's not about the Gulf or the Middle East. This conflict has everything to do with China. And the reason I say that is because President Trump is making the most audacious play after the establishment of the Bretton Woods institutions in 1944. When 44 countries signed up to peg their currency to the dollar, which was in turn, pegged to $35 per ounce of gold. And so if I could just break it down, I'll take a minute. So it was Venezuela first. Now, Venezuela had less to do with President Maduro and more to do with resources. And the principal joker or the principal actor in that scheme was China, which was getting crude from Venezuela at about $15 below the Brent discount, rare earth minerals, lithium. So Venezuela gets taken out first. The second, Trump has been repeatedly saying that Canada should be the 51st state of the United States. Now, a lot of people thought that it's hot air. It actually isn't. Trump believes that the entire North American continent should act as one political, economic, and security bloc. And this has not happened since World War II. So therefore, unfortunately, the best laid plans of men and mice don't turn out to be the way they are. So Carney became a bit of a joker in the pack. But Canada would be back on the front burner, unfortunately. And then you have Iran. Again, a huge crude oil supplier to China at a discount. And so once you've taken out Venezuela, you've taken out Iran, and you give an off-ramp to Russia. That off-ramp is already visible. Russian oil supplies have started flowing. Russia needs an out. They've had 500,000 dead since the Ukrainian war started. And the Canadians become the Arctic bridge to do that. So essentially, when you've removed two pillars of the BRICS, China and Russia, you've got India and Brazil left, which comparatively are, if I can say, not that major economies. And so essentially, once you unleash the US dollar-backed stable coin, you have a dollar reset. So therefore, this is about resource dominance, currency dominance, and it's about dollar continuing to be the reserve currency of the world. So it's a little more complicated than Netanyahu going after the Iranians and the Iranians firing missiles all over the place. Essentially, they are really collateral players in the scheme of things. So my sense is that this would go on for a while.
The way you put things in your book, Manish, you assert, and you're not equivocal about it, that the world order has changed. But we wonder, is it all because of one person, Donald Trump? Or would you say that tomorrow if there were a different president in the United States, 2 or 3 years down the line, would these trends continue or are they reversible in some sense?
So essentially, the US would be celebrating its 250th year of independence this year. Out of those 250 years, US has been at war with somebody or the other for 244 years. So therefore, they are continuums which essentially are there. But then and therein lies the paradox, after the Iraq and the Afghanistan engagement, which cost the US $8 trillion, a lot of blood and treasure, the United States was an exhausted power. And so therefore, there was a feeling that the more Jeffersonian or Jacksonian instincts would prevail in their foreign policy. They would become isolationists or at least turn inwards because the US desperately requires a infrastructure overhaul. And then that was Trump's first term. And then COVID-19 happened. And the moment the US emerged out of COVID-19 and Trump came back again, contrary to his first term, there suddenly seems to be this driving impulse to try and reorder the world. Now, either Mr. Trump has spent those 4 years seriously thinking, and a lot of people may laugh at that, but possibly seriously thinking things through in terms of continuing American dominance, or there's an invisible hand which continues to drive American foreign and strategic policy, which is again at play. So therefore, this is not going to end till the time the US has China where it wants it to be.
So you've talked of the elephant or the dragon in the room, China. It's a rising power, as you say. And will US efforts, will they turn into brinkmanship, which is a word often used for Donald Trump? Or, as you write about the Taiwan Strait, you worry about global conflict emanating from what's happening in the Taiwan Strait. And today we have another strait, Hormuz, where things are unfolding. And the outcome in Hormuz, would it impact China's view on what they can do in the Strait of Taiwan?
So essentially, if you look at the map of the world, there are 4 major choke points. So there is the Bab al-Mandab Straits, when you transit into the Persian Gulf from the Mediterranean Sea. Then you have the Straits of Hormuz. And then you have the Straits of Malacca as you go into Southeast Asia. And then you have the Taiwan Straits. So essentially, and that's how the energy supplies really flow. So for China, their biggest nightmare, which they've been trying to overcome now, going back to the early 90s, is what they call the Malacca dilemma. That if Malacca gets choked, then essentially China gets cut off, even if the Hormuz remains a transit point for the 19.5 million barrels which were going through it, before the current round started. It's down to about 0.5 million barrels a day. So essentially, the Chinese actually worry more about Malacca than any kind of a power play in the Taiwan Straits. And the reason why I say that is because way back in 1944, when Taiwan was called Formosa, and the Allied powers had absolute air and land supremacy, and they were planning the invasion of Japan. It was called Operation Causeway. So they wanted to invade Formosa and then use it as a staging ground to go to Okinawa and then on to Japan. But the plan had to be given up because it was a logistical nightmare to try and physically occupy Formosa. And Taiwan is no pushover. Taiwan has about 176,000 men in arms, another 167,000 as reservists. It has a modern air force. And of course, then it has the Silicon Shield. Right? So therefore, if Taiwan gets taken out, half the world's supply chain of semiconductors would collapse. So Taiwan is fairly insulated as of now. So the Chinese, if at all they make a move in Taiwan, it would be more of a psycho-op than actually a military operation. Because to physically get across the straits and occupy Taiwan is a challenge even for the Chinese. And therefore, there will be brinkmanship. And after all, it is after 1995 when the USS Nimitz actually sailed through the Taiwan Straits that China did a double-digit defense expenditure from 1995 to 2015. And even after that, it's 7.2% year on year. And today, China actually spends more on defense than the next 22 Indo-Pacific nations combined. And the US outspends China 4:1. So therefore, if you look at the power differential matrix, the power differential matrix in the Western Pacific, in the South China Sea, is of an order where, well, if you have an adventurous leadership, it's a different matter. But if you have a pragmatic leadership, I don't think the Chinese would make that play, at least at this point in time.
You mentioned the Taiwan Silicon Wall. We'll come to that in a while and India's possible role in it. But first, let's take everybody to the book itself. It's a great book, and we hope it will be a bestseller soon. It does demand a certain amount of intelligence of the reader, which is always a question mark. But tell me, what motivated you to start on this book, other than your astrologer, of course? Was it the competition? Was it, for example, S. Jaishankar's 2022 book, The India Way?
No, it has nothing to do with that. You see, between 2016 and 2019, when I was serving as a senior fellow with a think tank in Washington, D.C., called the Atlantic Council, it overlapped with President Trump's first term in office. And it was very evident to me because, the council has a lot of former cabinet officials and people who've served in governments around the world as fellows, both non-resident and resident, that there was a huge power vacuum which was opening up. The US was an exhausted power. It was financially depleted. They possibly were regretting, which does not seem to be the case today, but at that point in time, regretting the prolonged engagement in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And therefore, if the US was going to withdraw as the single biggest outside balancer of power in the world, who then would fill in that vacuum? And as someone who comes from India, it obviously was a matter of concern for me that the logical candidate was China. And given that we are cheek to jowl with them, we have a convoluted history and a present with them, it was something to be thought through, which really became the genesis of this book. And when I did the previous one, which was about the flashpoints on our national security, and when we finished that in 2021, by that time the COVID had already happened, the world had gone through a bit of an earthquake, to put it mildly, And that was a kind of an inflection point as to where do you really go from here. And that's why if you look at, if you look at the 5 broad themes that run through the book, the first obviously is that if at all there was a world order post 1945, that world order today has completely collapsed. So a new world order has not emerged. So we really are in an age of monsters, as Antonio Gramsci had said. And so where do we go from here? Would we regress back to the 19th century where raison d'etre, balance of power, are going to define the relationship between nations, or would something new emerge? The second overriding theme in the book is not the rise of China. It's the relentless rise of China. Since 1979, our GDPs were almost equal in 79-80, India and China. The rise has been so relentless that it's a 5-to-1 power differential and growing across the spectrum. Third, of course, given that the situation is very fluid, the biggest antidote to our national security is our social cohesion. And that social cohesion has been under considerable strain now for over a decade, if not more. And then, of course, there's been this great revolution in military affairs. The battlefield has completely changed. You saw it in Ukraine, you're seeing it in Iran, you saw it in the kinetic exchange between India and Pakistan last year. So therefore, in a completely changed battlefield, are the concepts of the 20th century at all relevant to fight a conflict of the 21st century? And then, of course, the elephant in the room, that if there is going to be a power vacuum, what is the role of middle powers? So essentially, those were the 4 or 5 themes that make the kernel of this book, if I can put it in those words.
So on that vein, let me take you forward in terms of how you foresee the future of the world order. You talk of 2 global axes, one perhaps led by the US, EU, Japan, and other liberal powers, and the other you talk of as the China, Russia, North Korea, and perhaps Iran axis, which stretches from the Far East to the west of the Asian mainland. And so for India, that becomes very important geopolitically. Then you go on to say that the coming years will constitute a humongous test for India's perennial quest for strategic autonomy. And to clear this test, I find 2 prescriptions in your book, you've mentioned them. One is what you call non-alignment 2, and the other is how India overcomes its internal issues and reaches a national consensus. So could you tell us more about this?
So essentially, if you look at the map of Asia, you have 4 nuclear powers which run from North Asia across the head and heart of Asia down into South Asia. So you've got North Korea, you've got China, you've got Russia, and you've got Pakistan, and of course Iran, which was then striving to be a nuclear power, or may still continue to be strive to be a nuclear power. And then there are very interesting relationships which have been resuscitated. So you have the China-North Korea relationship, the Russia-North Korea relationship, the China-Russia relationship, the North Korea-Pakistan relationship, which goes back to how they got their missile technology and bits and parts of even their nuclear technology. Then you have the China-Pakistan relationship. And you also have a burgeoning relationship between Russia and Pakistan. Now, these are not very comfortable relationships if you are sitting in New Delhi and looking at it, from our strategic perch. And over the past 5 or 7 years, these relationships have consolidated. On the other hand, you have an estrangement between India and the United States, and this estrangement is not primarily, because of President Trump. There have been structural issues which we've been trying to paper over in that relationship now for a while. And plus, you have an extremely virulent neighborhood. So you've had regime changes in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal. So therefore, if you were charged with crafting India's foreign policy, essentially, how would you navigate this conundrum? And the only way to navigate this conundrum is to go back to the basics. And what are those basics? You see, in World War I, 17 million people died. Another 81 million people died in the Second World War. Makes it 1 billion people. The atom bomb was tested in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing thousands and thousands of people. All through that very violent period of the 20th century, India experimented with a unique form of resistance called nonviolence. And we succeeded. So obviously, out of the graveyard of the world at that point in time, there had to be a third way. And that third way was non-alignment. And it was a conscious choice made given the times that were unfolding with imperialism and colonialism in retreat. And then as we went into the second or third decade of our independence, and you had the major power blocks turning their screws on us, the 62 border war with China, and then the problems that we had with food security, self-reliance was the only way forward. Even today, they remain the two strategic continuums in our national thought. You can call non-alignment multi-alignment if you do not like the term non-alignment because a certain political dispensation had done that. You can call self-reliance Atmanirbharta if that sounds better. But essentially, that is really where we are. And that's why I'm saying that there has to be a minimum political consensus, at least in the foreign policy space, over the next 2.5 decades, because they are going to be extremely difficult decades for this country, irrespective of who's in office. And that is why Indian exceptionalism has to be predicated on A, building our internal strength as much as possible. Then that involves keeping social cohesion in the forefront. And then, of course, trying to engage with people to the extent that we can, because you can't be unilateral all the time, but to the extent that you can, from a vantage point of Indian exceptionalism, which is non-alignment or multi-alignment. And that's essentially what even this government is doing today.
So you spoke of exceptionalism. Let's come to our neighborhood. You have 3 chapters in your book on the countries neighboring India, especially China. People from outside India, Lee Kuan Yew, for example, when he headed Singapore, used to lament the fact that India focuses too much on its immediate neighbor and has no time for Singapore. He, for example, wanted a brigade of the Indian Army stationed in Singapore. He was concerned about communist influence amongst the Chinese-speaking majority in his country. That never happened. Today, you write, especially with reference to Bangladesh, India needs to be seen as both a factor of stability and prosperity for its eastern neighbor. How do we do this?
You know, this is the most interesting paradox. Our problems with Pakistan go back to the creation of Bangladesh. It was the quest to liberate the people of East Pakistan from the atrocities that they were being subject to, which essentially led Pakistan uh, to formulate two policy objectives. One, that they will acquire nuclear weapons, even if it meant eating grass. And number two, they would bleed India with 1,000 cuts. And this goes back to the Multan Conference of the January of 1972. And that's been Pakistan's continuous impulse. Unfortunately, and this is something which needs to be very, very seriously looked into, that we have kept losing Bangladesh periodically between 1971 and now. And that really shouldn't have happened. For example, in 2019, you know, I went from the inauguration of the Kartarpur Sahib corridor straight to Dhaka for a conference. And so there's a museum out there, there's a war museum. And I went to see that museum. And I was quite intrigued. See, the Indian contribution to the Bangladeshi freedom struggle has been played down very substantially. To a certain extent, I thought that, of course, as a country, they would obviously want to put their own contribution first, but the level to which it had been muted was something which was a matter of concern. And this was Sheikh Hasina's government. This was not, you know, a dispensation which was essentially hostile to India. And so, therefore, Pakistan as a problem falls in a different bucket. But minus Pakistan, you know, if we have to really implement, or if we do believe that we have a Monroe Doctrine in South Asia, we need to walk that extra mile with the rest of our neighbors. For example, the Hambantota port was offered to us. In 2008 or 2006, if I remember correctly, the Hambantota port was actually offered to us to develop. When we unfortunately did nothing, it went to the Chinese. Similarly, you know, with Maldives, with Nepal, you know, I mentioned a large number of projects with Nepal which have been languishing for a very long time. So I think we need to really up our game in our neighborhood, because the neighborhood, whether you like it or not, is bending to the Chinese wind.
One big factor where China would matter in future especially is water. China is building this big dam on the Brahmaputra, the Sangpo. And you mentioned that in our relations with both Nepal, you mentioned the Mahakali project, and Bangladesh, you give a detailed description of the Tista River water dispute. So how important is water, and how should India resolve these water issues with its neighbors?
Well, the paradox is that we've not been able to resolve the water issue between Punjab and Haryana now. So therefore, yeah, with and of course Rajasthan and Himachal Pradesh thrown in. So we have quite a bit of a conundrum in the region itself. But you see, essentially this is going to be a kind of an inflection point for the future also. The Chinese are building the biggest dam on Sangpo, which is the upper reaches of the Brahmaputra. Now, if that dam were to come to fruition, this means the riparian rights of the downstream states, India especially, and our northeastern states, are going to be almost hostage to what the Chinese essentially intend to do. You know, we've been trying a bit of water coercion with Pakistan, but then, you know, you could possibly do one thing on one side without realizing that it will be done to you on the other side. So therefore, this uh, the, the 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 entire gamut of water in South Asia has to be looked at very differently. You see, this is the first time in history when the Indo-Gangetic Plain and the Indus River Valley Basin actually fall into different political geographies. If you look at history as a continuum, always the Indus River Valley Basin and the Indo-Gangetic Plain or the Gangetic Basin had a kind of a synergy and an interface. Because of the political realities, they now fall into different geographies, which in itself is a problem. And does the South Asian leadership or does the broader leadership in the region have the capacity to really put water in a different bucket? Because connected with water is the whole question of climate change and a lot of other non-traditional security issues. So we really have to think about water in a very different way. I'm afraid if that doesn't sound like an answer, it is because I really don't have an answer to that.
In your book, you mention two axes concerning China, and you do give answers for what's happening in those axes. One is the Russia-China-USA relationship revolving around the conflict in Ukraine. And your suggestion there is that a very swift resolution of the Ukraine war would be to India's best advantage. Now, if that is not happening, how best can India deal with a bad situation?
So, if Ukraine was to sort itself out, essentially, as I said earlier, the Russians are also looking for an off-ramp. And if that off-ramp becomes that they keep Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea, and so therefore that kind of settles it, it would be the best thing which would happen to us. It may not be the best thing which happens to Ukraine, primarily because we are trying to draw closer to the Europeans, right? So therefore, there has been this huge push after the Trump administration has acted not too politely with Europe and not too very politely with us also. But Ukraine remains an irritant because the Europeans always demanded, and maybe rightly so, that we take a more forward-leaning position on the Ukrainian question. Unfortunately, because of our relationship with Russia, and there's a huge defense relationship there, we've not been able to do that. We are constrained. So if Ukraine was to sort itself out, it would actually free us up to be able to engage with Europe a little more aggressively, because the markets that we will lose out in the United States, right? It's not about putting tariffs up and putting tariffs down. Once there's a breach of confidence, there's a break in trust. People who actually put their money where their mouth is become very, very circumspect. So the relationship with the US, the trade relationship in the US, is not going to go back. It may go back in volumes to what it was, but there would always be this lurking fear at the back of your mind. God alone knows, when this would happen. So that's why I was saying that if Ukraine gets resolved, and which it might, because already the Central European powers have started demanding that the Druzhba pipeline should be repaired. Hungary and Slovakia and the others. The Europeans are now asking Ukraine that we should be allowed to import gas from Russia again because of what is happening in the Middle East. So were Middle East to prolong for the next month or so, even for 30 days, you might actually see things moving on the Ukrainian front, and that would really be good from an Indian perspective.
Let's come closer home to the border with China. You write very interestingly that the border dispute is a strategic stressor for New Delhi that Beijing leverages to pressure New Delhi as and when it desires. Therefore, it has no intention of finding a permanent resolution. This band-aid approach suits China. China will also use India's neighbors to strategically tie up India. If this is true, and if China continues to be our largest trading partner, how do we handle this situation?
So China has 22 neighbors. It has 17 land boundary neighbors and about five countries with which it has disputes on the littoral. China has resolved its land boundary disputes with 15 of them. And often, what was their ask and what they settled for, there is a huge difference in that. Russia, I mean, the erstwhile Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, there are umpteen examples. Most of their outstanding territorial disputes are now in the littorals, in the maritime domain. But they have chosen not to resolve it with India, and by extension Bhutan. And now they are in the process of resolving it with Bhutan also. So essentially that leaves us out. Now, why is it the Chinese are not interested in resolving it? Or is it that we are being intransigent? The fact is that we are two rising Asian powers. And so therefore it suits China, since they've built up this power differential, to keep us under pressure. And from the Chinese perspective, as I've written in the book, it's not so much about the line of actual control. It's about Tibet. It's about Tibet.
You do write about Tibet, and you mentioned that way back in 1964, Mao Zedong had said that the major problem between the two countries, China and India, was not the McMahon line. It was the Tibet question. So does the Tibet question give any leverage to India to counter China?
Look, the fact is that China is...
You don't have to answer that.
No. That's all right. The fact is that China is under, has extra-legally occupied Tibet, right? Tibet was independent between 1912 and 1956, when the PLA occupied it. Essentially, when the Qing dynasty collapsed, they exercised their own suzerainty, if not sovereignty. And then the PLA marched into Tibet. Now, we are actually accused that we did not do anything very much to help the Tibetans at that point in time. But what people do forget is that the Tibetans themselves had signed the 17-point agreement with the government in Beijing, or Peking as it was then called. And even on the United Nations fora, the Tibetan question was not getting very much of resonance. So a lot of water has really flowed under the bridge since then. We do now accept a one China policy. So therefore we've made a very, very unambiguous declaration which has gone across various dispensations. But then we do continue to host the Dalai Lama also. So therefore, I think in terms of realpolitik, this is something which has been played well by us.
I agree. So lastly, let me move from our neighbors to defense and energy. And in your book, you have a very interesting new proposition, which may sound a bit Trumpian, so let me read it out. India can no longer afford a lopsided relationship with defense and energy supplying countries. It should purchase these strategic goods only from countries that it broadly trades with, and require its defense and energy suppliers to substantially raise their imports from India. That premium Because if you import from countries which you should not, you will perhaps pay more, which is what you are saying here. That premium is the price to pay for strategic autonomy. So tell us about this strategic premium.
So, if you were to rewind back a little into history, we had a three-pillar relationship with the former Soviet Union. One was there was uh, ideological compatibility. The second was that there was a shared belief in the commanding heights of socialism, right? An emphasis on state-owned enterprises. And the third was a defense relationship. And now there is only the defense relationship which is left. The other two pillars over a period of time have gone away. We've not been able to move beyond the defense relationship with Russia. In fact, every ambassador who gets posted to, every Indian ambassador who gets posted to Russia, always laments this, that we've not really been able to move beyond that. Now, this is, by way of example, this is not to say that the Indo-Russian relationship is not an important relationship. Now, if you come to China, we've just come out of a 4-year border standoff with them. Still you have the buffer zones questions unresolved. But you have $100 billion in an adverse trade balance with them. So, therefore, and then you have the European countries, and you have the United States of America. If you dehorse this integrum, which hopefully will end in another 2.5 years, and you can possibly go back to a relationship which is on a more even keel, you actually share not only a civilizational and a democratic ethos with them, but over a period of time, you've been able to develop those convergences, which may be under strain at this point in time. But when you're looking at the trajectory of nations, you do not look at the next 2 years alone. So under those circumstances, it would then become easier to find compatibility between your defense, strategic, and economic relationships. Now there is a divergence. So you have a defense relationship which leans towards one side very heavily, and you have your economic and strategic relationships which lean towards the other side. And at some point in time, this may end up becoming a double whammy. That's why I write that it is important going forward, we need to bring about this convergence of thought in our political, economic, strategic, and our defense relationship.
Very perspicuous. We're running out of time, Manish, so I'll end with a personal question. How optimistic are you about the future of India in this world adrift? And how do you see your own role in this as a parliamentarian, as an opinion leader, as a legislator, lawmaker, lawyer, legal expert?
Look, India will sail through, right? And the reason why I say that is that it is important, as Deng Xiaoping said, that we need to feel the stones beneath our feet and walk carefully. So the next 2 decades or 2.5 decades is about walking carefully. We need to shed delusions of grandeur, because I think delusions of grandeur only serve to delude us. They do not delude anybody else in the world. And if we are able to maintain our strategic autonomy, the space that we've carved out over the past 7 decades, I think we would have done well. At times when things are in motion around you, and in this case, almost in a whirl, it's better to stand still. And so therefore, there is wisdom in being cautious. And if India really energizes its exceptionalism and is able to the extent that it can, engage with the world on its terms, I think we will get through. India's time will come, but it is not the next 2.5 decades. The next 2.5 decades is actually space for consolidation.
So you didn't answer the second half, but we'll leave that for another. We'll leave that for another.
Well, in the sense,
session.
you see, I think it's very important that we need to keep our institutional integrity intact. Any democracy is as weak or strong as the institutions it stands on. So therefore, if we are able to keep our institutional integrity sacrosanct, if parliamentarians can only do one thing, which is ensure that parliament starts functioning, right? I think we would have done this country a great service. So it's a very small ask, but otherwise you will have the withering away of institutions. And if at all India gets challenged, the challenge is not going to be from outside. The challenge is going to be from within. And I'll give you an example. You see, if you look at the British Empire in the northeast and the northwest managed India's periphery by a series of treaties. When we transitioned from being an empire to a country, we decided to manage it through constitutional guarantees. Now, even if you dilute one constitutional guarantee, it has implications on the rest. And therefore, our problems, even today as a country, the bulk of our problems, especially from the national security point of view, still continue to be in the northwest and the northeast of India, where our minorities reside. So therefore, that's why I'm saying that if we keep our institutions resuscitated, we are watchful about what is happening, and try and move towards the middle. Because India, given its diversity and given its heterogeneous nature, can only be governed from the middle. If you take an extreme position, ultimately it will come back to bite you, if not today, maybe 5 years or 10 years down the line. And that's why I say the challenge to India, as and when it comes, will not come from outside, it will come from within.
Wonderful, Manish. Very insightful. I'm sure the audience has some questions, comments.
You can take this.
No, it's working. Thank you. So for Punjab Lit Foundation event is never complete without a spirited exchange of ideas. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions from Mr. Tewari and Mr. Singh. Please keep your questions very brief so that we can hear from as many of you as possible. We have volunteers who will be bringing the mic to you. And amongst our speakers, I request you to share one mic, please. Thank you. You've got the mic?
Thank you, Manish, for a very insightful discussion. I haven't read the book, but I'm definitely going to read it now. I think you mentioned our neighbors. And there are two neighbors you didn't talk about. One was Bhutan and the other is Myanmar. And they also have a lot of Chinese influence. But my question is more like, has our obsession with self-reliance and non-alignment caused us to kind of just focus on ourselves and not really look around beyond our borders?
So, well, if you go back to the founding of the Indian state or the Indian Republic, even before we got independent, we had actually hosted the Asian Relations Conference in the June of 1947. So India, across the past 7 decades, irrespective of whichever may have been the political dispensation, has really never been inward-looking, right? We have engaged with some of the most difficult questions in the world. At times, rather bravely, at times rather evasively, but that is what real politics is all about. So to say that, our obsession with non-alignment or our obsession with self-reliance has made us inward-looking or isolationist, I don't think it is true, because look, if we would have done enough, and if we could have done enough, and this is, I'm not being critical of A dispensation or B dispensation, if we could have done enough in terms of energy security, right? We wouldn't have been reliant to the extent of 85% on crude oil and 47% on natural gas. And the reason I'm saying that is that, look, we could have done renewables much better. We have so much of sunlight, we have wind, we have offshore wind. So therefore, there is a lot that we could have done with regard to renewables to offset this dependence. Now, if this conflict were to continue, coming back to from where Karan started, well, LPG is going to be a problem. Essentially, Straits of Hormuz, you have 20 or 21 million barrels getting through per day. It's down to 0.5 million. So obviously it's going to have an impact. So I don't think, to answer your question, that our reliance on either of these two fundamental postulates has made us inward looking.
Okay. Hi. Sure. You go ahead first, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Tewari. I am just curious to know about your comments on the timing of two diplomatic engagements that India recently entered into and which are under immense scrutiny. One diplomatic engagement, the timing of one diplomatic engagement is the timing of signing of the framework trade deal with the US. And the other is the timing of the diplomatic engagement by way of visit of the Indian Prime Minister to Israel. So how do these timings of these two diplomatic engagements reflect on our diplomacy? Thank you.
See, both the questions are essentially political in nature. So you will have to wait for a week. If there is a debate in Parliament, you will definitely hear me on both these questions. Not here.
Hi, sir. Here. Hi. So I'll ask you a more practical question, being an entrepreneur. You said that, we are dependent on our energy needs, 85% from, outside India. We don't manufacture our arms. We are, the highest importing arms. You've been in the, in the position of the government. Why India has not been able to become self-sufficient on the basic infrastructure needs like energy and arms? What has stopped us, and how you feel this can be resolved?
So look, it ultimately boils down to a function of resources. So what is the size of the union budget? Most of the money to do either energy security or to, up your defense expenditure comes out of the union budget. So what's the size of the union budget? Is about 52 lakh crores as of this year. How much revenue do we mobilize? About 36 lakh crores. So there's a gap of about 18 lakh crores. Out of those 52 lakh crores, what is it that we have in terms of committed liabilities? Almost close to 47 lakh crores. So what is the kind of wiggle room that any government would have? It is about 3, 4, 5 lakh crores. So ultimately, that's the kind of money that you have to, you have available to play with, given that private capital expenditure has not been happening ever since COVID-19. So till the time you do not broaden your tax base, till the time you do not have more revenue coming into the coffers of the government, your ability to be able to do more for some of the critical things which are essential for your survival as a nation state gets severely constricted. And This is not an excuse or an apology for not doing enough. This is unfortunately the reality that eventually everything boils down to a function of resources. And that's why across governments, going back to Dr. Manmohan Singh and late Dr. Manmohan Singh in 1991, when he liberalized the Indian economy, and a policy which has held through different dispensations now for over 3.5 decades, the whole effort was to see as to how entrepreneurship can really kick in, private entrepreneurship can really kick in and take on the responsibilities of the state. Unfortunately, in some areas we have succeeded. In large number of areas we have not succeeded. So therefore, if private investment is going to remain sluggish for whatever reasons, then the only way out is that you broaden your tax base, which doesn't mean that you raise taxes on people, but you obviously have to have more people paying tax. You cannot support the development of a country on a tax base of 5 lakh people.
I have a question. India is the largest democracy, 4th largest economy, investing so much in enhancing the relationship with the US. So what explains Trump or US administration targeting India so selectively? Was it just because India taking oil from Russia? Or is there something else? How do you explain the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2 administration?
So, well, I think I tried to explain it in the beginning of this interaction. And as I said, see, Trump 1 was different because the United States was an exhausted power at that point in time, and Trump was also trying to learn the ropes, right? Trump 2 happens at a different point in time in history. And obviously, either President Trump himself or the advisors that he has around him are concerned about continuing US dominance, at least for the foreseeable future or the remaining decades of the 21st century. And that's why a lot of what you see playing itself out today has to do with resource dominance, keeping the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. So therefore, there is a much larger game at play. You see, India, or for that matter, even Iran, which is unfortunately, getting bombed day in and day out relentlessly, are really, if I can say, collateral damage in a much bigger play which is unfolding. So if you look beyond the headlines, we will be able to figure out a pattern. And that would really explain the second iteration of the Trump presidency.
To the lovely audience here, I'm afraid I'll have to announce there is only room for one more question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Tewari. My question is regarding the choke points.
Please sit.
I beg to differ on one issue of Malacca Strait. And you forgot Bosphorus and Dardanelles in the wake of Ukraine-Russian war. That's a big choke point. The real 2 choke points are only Bab el-Mandab and Hormuz. Malacca Strait only can give you 65 feet of draft, and most VLCCs, very large crude carriers, cannot go through. At full load, they have to lighten. So the big boys always go through Sunda or Lombok Strait. So I think Indian analysts and most politicians overhype Malacca. I don't think it's really that important. And I've personally been through all these, including commanding a 400,000 tonner through Lombok. Thank you.
Well, I stand enlightened, and we can have an offline conversation on this. I would welcome it.
Thank you.
So the conversation does not have to end here. Let's move to the social media from here, please. Thank you. Please do visit the bookstall outside, which has been organized by Rupa Publications and Capital Bookstore, and you will find copies of A World Adrift. And most importantly, Mr. Tewari has agreed to stay for a few minutes to sign those copies. Thank you.
Can we have last one? Can we have last one question, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So, in fact, I had 2 in mind, quick ones. One is talking about dear neighbor Pakistan. So how do you see the Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Baloch equation evolving? And do we have any role of India in that? That's one. Second is, so you being in charge of, I&B ministry earlier. So Indian media is kind of, becoming a joke at the international level, how hyper they are and how they blow things out of proportion. So do you think any framework needs to be put in that perspective to kind of rein it in?
So on the second question, I can write a PhD thesis. So I will recess that, right? Great. On the first question, well, the Afghans have not recognized the Durand Line, going back to 1872, irrespective of Pakistan's quest for strategic depth, whichever may have been the dispensation, even the most Pakistan-friendly dispensation has never recognized the Durand Line. So therefore, it's a fool's errand that Pakistan has been on ever since they lost the eastern part of their country, thanks again to their depredations on that population. And that is now playing itself out in its latest iteration between what is happening between the Pakistan military and the Taliban.
Thank you.
Thank you
so
to
much.
the speakers, lovely audience, and the organizers.
Thanks, Karan, for doing this.